Good afternoon to everybody. I'm Lee Little, I'm the Dean of the Library, and on behalf of the Friends of the Library and the entire library staff, I'd like to first welcome you to a reading and presentation of some very extraordinary work done by a group of students. It's not, I would say, we have lots of students who do some really fascinating kinds of stuff, but what you're going to see this afternoon is truly extraordinary. We have a group of students who actually, in the course of an academic program, completed a book, and I would say a very significant contribution to the archives of environmental activism. And so I would like to, first of all, on behalf of the Friends of the Library, thank the faculty and students who participated in producing this wonderful book, Defending Wild Washington, A Citizen's Guide. And with that, I'll turn it over to the faculty, Ted Weitzel, Oscar Sewell, and the students. And we'll have a reading and a sharing of some of their ideas that went into the book, and perhaps even get into some of the environmental issues that make up this wonderful body of work.
Thanks, Lee. Join us. There's plenty of seats in front. Thank you all for coming. This is a really special event for us. The book right now is in the promotion stage, and a number of students and faculty have been going to conferences and bookstores and other events where we're presenting the work. But this one, I think, is probably the most meaningful. First of all, it's at our institutional home, Evergreen, and we owe such a large number of debts to the people who are here and the organizations who are here, including among the very most important, the Friends of the Evergreen State Library, who pitched in with substantial help so that we could produce the book of the sort that we want. And the institution itself, in many ways, through staff, administration, and financial support, made this book possible. And it's also a time when we're here in a fairly large group. We have just slightly over half of the student authors here. There were 17 students who wrote this book. And there were 3 faculty members, the 2 of whom are here right now, myself and Oscar Sewell. Oscar worked on the program last year in the fall quarter, and then Ben Shane was a visiting faculty member here in the winter quarter, and I worked on the program through the fall, winter, and spring quarters of last year. So it's a very special time because we don't usually have as many of us here. It's kind of like a reunion for us, and it's really exciting. One of the things that made this project work was that we did form a really tight-knit group. It was the most exhausting, time-consuming, demanding, stressful project I think that the students had ever worked on in their entire student career. And it certainly was the most exhausting, time-consuming, stressful program that I had ever worked on in all the years that I've been teaching. But we never lost the enthusiasm for the program. We always were so excited by the fact that we could actually produce a book, and that it could be a really good book, not just any old book, just to say that we've done a book, but it could be a major contribution to a field of literature. And bragging a little bit, I think we feel that we actually succeeded in what we wanted to do. By the end of the spring quarter last year, we had this. It was exactly 1 year ago that we had our end of the quarter potluck. And it turned out that it was not only an end of the quarter potluck, but it was also a contract signing party. We didn't go into this program in the fall of last year with any contact with a publisher at all. We just had a concept in mind. And by the winter quarter, we approached the publisher, the Mountaineers Books, which is the publisher that really was ideal for this project, and they fell in love with the program and the project instantly, and have been really supportive throughout. And so by the end of the quarter potluck, at the end of the spring quarter last year, we had a contract with signature lines for each and every student in the program, and they signed a book contract and then went on their ways. And the result then is quite different. You can come up and look at this Xerox copy of what we had at the end of the year of writing and rewriting and rewriting and rewriting, and then compare it with the final product, and we feel really pleased that it's finally taken the shape that we had envisioned. I don't want to say too much more about it because we have a lot of people who'd like to do readings for you, selections from the book, so you can get a flavor of the work that was done, the content, the style, some of the key messages that we'd like to get across. So that's all that I'll say, but I'd like to turn it over to Oscar so he can say a few things also about the program that produced this book.
Thank you. This was a most amazing project, as Ted has said, and I think everybody involved would agree that a great deal, if not the lion's share of the credit for the success of the project falls to Ted for what he did and how he did it. When we first came up with the idea, it was Ted's idea to write a book. He had seen a book that had been written by a group of students in Utah and felt that with a change of subject and a local focus, we could do something of this nature. And we screened the students very carefully and ended up with a most amazing group of students in the sense that they all are special. I think they're maybe they're very average in the sense that they're not, none of the students were selected because of any sense of genius that they had, but they were very interested in working hard on a project. And we were interested in students who would work well together and students who would follow through. And in doing so, they became geniuses. And they found their own voice, and that was one of the hardest things for them to accept, that how could they, as students who were learning something in a sense for the first time, create a product that other people would not only use, but they'd listen to. Who were they to tell these other folks what and how they might think? And through their writing and through their cooperation and through their love for each other, they achieved that in a close to perfect manner. I would close by telling two very short stories. The first had to do with our meeting with the Mountaineers, because Ben and Ted and I felt that we had a bit of a tough sell, so we'd find a likely publisher and go and try out our sell on them. And then when we got turned down, we'd learn from that process how to do it better the next time. So we went into the Mountaineers office and we met with Helen, and we started talking, and she started taking notes, and then she got up and she started walking around, and pretty soon she was telling us what a great project this was, and on and on and on, and we came out of that with this ultimate agreement to work with the Mountaineers. And that tells you something about the magic of the project, because by that time we knew the students and who they were, and felt that we knew what they were capable of doing. The second has to do with the fact that about an hour ago I completed my last evaluation conference as a faculty member here. And in rough numbers, it was probably number 1,800. And so that caused me to think back over the other 1,799 students. And I must say that this group of students is so special that this project, I feel, is one of all the ones over the 33 years with which I've been involved that gives me the most satisfaction. And so if you can understand in that context how I feel, I hope you will read the book, and even better yet, you'll buy the book and then read it, because all the royalties will go back into the Evergreen State College, and you'll see how I feel. So thank you.
My name is Melissa Carter. I graduated from Evergreen last year, and I'm going to be reading a section of the book called Art of Compromise. Throughout Washington's long conservation history, lands have consistently been compromised to gain protection of others. This type of negotiation has always been in the cards for conservationists. beginning with the 1890s concessions to the Railroad companies for land now within Mount Rainier National Park, and continuing throughout the century as recently as the I-90 and Gifford-Pinchot National Forest land exchange. Early compromises continue to resonate throughout the movement. In the early 1950s, the wilderness movement enjoyed its then largest success with the campaign to stop the Echo Park Dam from being erected in Dinosaur National Monument, Colorado. Among the trade-offs was the construction of Glen Canyon Dam in Utah, a loss that would eventually help spark the direct action civil disobedience promoted by activist and author Edward Abbey. Memory of this compromise was visible in 1998 when the I-90 land exchange created wilderness study area near Alpine Lakes Wilderness, but also slated ancient forest for logging in the nearby Gifford-Pinchot National Forest. To protect the exchange, activists went to Plum Creek Timber Company's headquarters, brandishing large symbolic banners. The words of environmental icon David Brower waved above the crowd, echoing across decades his sorrow over the loss of Glen Canyon. Never trade a place you've seen for one you haven't. While the land exchange was not initiated by citizen action, the initial support it received from wilderness advocates in the Middle Cascades created animosity between the branches of the movement. Animosity that still exists today. In the heat of the controversy, direct action old growth defenders threw cream pie in the face of longtime activists who supported the exchange. To see such resources spent between activists when they might be spared and used on common foes raises questions as to how the movement can better unify its objectives or clarify intended outcomes. In today's movement, there are more specific defenders for Washington's wild areas than ever before, making it difficult to negotiate through compromise without stepping on the toes of colleagues. In campaigns of the past, organizing resources were limited and lands were forfeited in hopes they would be protected by future generations. That future seems to have arrived. Like the close of the frontier, there may be limited chances tomorrow to protect what remains today. A kind of environmental accountability is increasingly recognized as a component of successful conservation campaign, whether it assesses the unseen trade-offs of resources around the world or the forest next door. It is doubtful there will ever be enough pieces of the conservation pie, but by striving to better unify the voices of the movement through substantial communication, activists will improve internal relations and start to tear down the walls that prevent effective cooperation. To do this without backing away from the challenges of negotiating bold, proactive campaigns is the test to which the movement must apply its renowned determination.
So next I'll try to face everyone at the same time. My name is Ellen Trescott, and I graduated from Evergreen in December of this past year. Just to preface this, we visited so many places around Washington while we wrote this book that I kind of started to think of all the people that we met and the issues that we were discussing in terms of a broad landscape. And so in this passage I tried to draw that analogy as best as I could. If the conservation community in Washington state were analogous to a biological community, it would have its own distinct ecology. The broad membership base for environmental activism can be imagined as soil, rich with viable seeds and nourishing the entire community. Volunteer outreach organizers percolate like water through this layer, supplying nutrients to revitalize the soil and allowing seeds to sprout. Over time, this grassroots layer has grown and been enriched with popular and financial support that has affected change and helped define what the movement is today, for better and worse. Ancient trees watch over the terrain, their wisdom and experience providing both cover and competition for younger communities. The value of this grove is undisputed, though its legacy depends on the succession of the plants below. This understory, or next generation of activists, is a community of small trees and shrubs, born of seeds spread from an extended range. The landscape upon which the biological community grows is subject to occasional disturbance such as fire. Sometimes burning briefly and at other times with intensity, the forces of fire translate into political, social, and economic disturbances that change and renew the landscape. Ancient trees still stand, weathered a bit by such events, and grass regrows vigorously from its steadfast roots. The shrub layer is transformed, some groups perishing while others strive to assert their place among the dominant species. As a natural observer, one should be wary of ever viewing the activist landscape as existing in a climax state. Surely, without internal evolution and external disturbance, the movement would stagnate. The survival and success of the Wildlands movement depends upon its ability to embrace dynamic social change and to adapt to it. It's important to acknowledge the changing roles that citizen activists play within the movement today, and how they're influenced by such realities as the rise in professionalism over volunteerism and current methods of communication and grassroots organizing. The limited amount of inclusion and outreach to diverse ethnic and racial populations, as well as the issue of gender equality, are also worthy of attention from the movement as a whole. By addressing the components of this social ecology, the conservation community increases its potential for effective advocacy and protection of Washington's wildness.
My name is Tyler Winchell, and I received my bachelor's last June. I'm going to read a passage talking about radical environmentalism and its effect on the movement for wildness in Washington state. Perched high above a landscape of fragmented clear-cuts, tree sitters see their action as a stand against corporate greed, epitomized by logging the last precious scape of ancient forest. Perhaps the bird's eye view from the canopy has made it easier for Washington's direct action activists to see the metaphorical forest rather than just the ancient trees. Their actions have broken molds over the past several years, from requiring the first permit from the Forest Service for an authorized tree sit to standing in solidarity with striking unionists. They have denounced the negative impacts of extractive industries dominated by large corporate conglomerates and have demanded accountability to the earth, local communities, and laborers. Activists committed to civil disobedience tend to combine participation in the wildlands movement with actions and campaigns to expose the failures of a globalized, unrestrained, and consolidated system of laissez-faire capitalism. One follower of this radical ecology contends that ecological collapse is the central and most visible contradiction in the global system. To meet their goals, direct action activists have fostered many new alliances. In December 1998, on the docks of the Port of Tacoma, an unusual set of partners came together in solidarity. Members of the industrial workers of the world, striking steelworkers, and Earth First activists staged a protest at the Kaiser Aluminum Company, attempting to prevent the docking of a barge full of steel bound for Spokane. Activists scaled the crane at the site as if it were an old-growth hemlock, unfurling a large banner that read, "Hurwitz cuts trees like he cuts jobs." The banner was in reference to the Texan, whose company, Maxim, owns a large share in both Kaiser and the Pacific Lumber Company, which has been the target of redwood tree sits and other actions in Northern California. Steelworker Don Kegley commented, "All the environmentalists have been inspirational to us. If a 24-year-old girl can sit in a tree for a year and not even wear shoes for months, then by God, 3,000 steelworkers ought to be able to kick Charlie Hurwitz's ass." We really have to thank all the people that are involved for the great inspiration that you've given us. I'm not so sure we'd be as strong as we are without it. It's give and take on both sides, and it's an alliance that I'm proud of.
My name is Oliver Smith, and I'm going to be graduating tomorrow. And I worked on a part of the book that was about the eastern realms of the state, the little-known struggles that have gone on over there. And I'm going to be reading Out of the Rain, Defending the Wild East. A beautiful and diverse landscape exists in Washington's eastern reaches, with many threats and challenges to its ecological integrity. Some of these lands have retained their natural character because of unusual circumstances, as with the Hanford nuclear site. Other places have stayed out of the spotlight because of their stronger association with other states, such as the Selkirk, Cabinet Yaak, Grizzly Recovery Area. Still others have remained relatively intact because they are simply out of the way in low population areas, as with the Wenonah-Tucannon Wilderness in the Blue Mountains. The overarching reason, however, that there are wild places left in the Columbia Basin, the northwestern reach of the Rockies, and the Blue Mountains, is because there are dedicated citizens who have worked hard, made sacrifices, and devoted their time and energy for the cause. It is because they feel so strongly for these wild lands and the need for their protection that they are willing to give so much of themselves to protect the land they love. In western Washington, there are many like-minded people who share appreciation of untrammeled wilderness. Preservation is quite popular in the western part of the state, and at times it can feel like preaching to the choir when speaking about the benefits of wildlands preservation. There's certainly less personal risk associated with criticizing old-growth logging, protecting roadless areas, opposing clear-cuts, or even advocating removal of dams. On the east side, things are different. Conservationists still face challenges that harken back to an earlier era in which opposition was fierce and wildlands preservation was still considered a wild idea. It calls for the truly dedicated to speak out and organize to effect change under these circumstances, the likes of which many younger conservationists have not had to face. When it is time to defend the ecosystems you love, where you live and what the popular vote happens to be become irrelevant. What matters is that committed citizens step up and speak out against harmful practices that destroy the wild integrity of the lands they cherish.
My name is Rick Darnell. I graduated from the Evergreen State College last year, the bachelor's, and have continued my education in the master's program here at Evergreen State. One of the lessons that I learned in writing this book was that in environmental activism, it takes an idea that you need to follow through with. And one of the themes that we developed was this idea of envisioning a wild future. In chapter 11, part of that is the big picture, which I'll read to you here today. The realization of a wild future starts with a dream for the land itself. Some look beyond the realm of what seems practical, with goals that encompass vast tracts of protected land supporting a plethora of native species. Such thinking is true to the earliest ideals of visionaries like George Catlin, who in 1932 proposed a park stretching from Canada to Mexico to protect the Great Plains and its native peoples. Today's scientific knowledge has informed and influenced the design and ecological importance of these visions. The advancing field of conservation biology, among other scientific disciplines, has shown the need for planning on a large scale that encompasses extensive landscapes and regions. Many wild habitats in Washington have been heavily fragmented, and scientists point out the need to protect not only the core wild areas, but also corridors to connect them and buffer zones to surround them. Protected wilderness cores can support wide-ranging species like large carnivores, but the protected corridors are necessary to connect these cores and to provide avenues for migration and dispersal of species. The value of human-managed natural areas that border wildlands is also increasingly being recognized. As suburban development encroaches upon farms and forests, bold ambitions to protect this range of interconnecting habitats are essential for two reasons. The everyday success of the conservation movement can be diminished without overall goals that inspire. And ultimately, safeguarding biodiversity requires this scale of foresight. In 1991, former Earth First leader Dave Foreman and conservation biologist Michael Soule formed what is now called the Wildlands Project. The project asserts that large swaths of wildlands are necessary for the preservation of biological diversity. The long-term wilderness recovery strategy promoted by the project contains a network of connected reserves across the North American continent. Washington State is home to 3 of these proposed reserves, including the Rainforest to Rockies and Yellowstone to Yukon initiatives, and the Central Cascade Wildlands Restoration and Protection Project. Through each of these initiatives, though each of these initiatives is unique, each has in common Wildlands Project goals, including protection of wild cores like wilderness, which can be connected by habitat corridors. Surrounding the cores and corridors would be wilderness recovery areas or habitat buffers and compatible use areas for forestry, grazing, and active recreation. The Wildlands Project differs from traditional wilderness preservation campaigns in its ambitious scope, and the attainment of its goals will be a long process. Several groups in Washington are contributing to the extensive research and planning required by such a large proposal, including the Wilderness Society, the Central Cascade Alliance, the Northwest Ecosystem Alliance. As impractical as project goals may seem, their implications for the future is far-reaching. Wilderness Society President Bill Meadows sits on the board of directors for the Wildlands Project. He says, "I am aware of the debate between vision and pragmatism. But if we do not have a vision, we won't get the practical results we deserve." They, the Wildland Project, have a vision that inspires all of us.
My name is Katie Jones, and myself, Tony, and Glenn worked on a case study of conservation efforts in the Puget Lowlands. And one of the challenges that we faced was trying to show a picture of what there is to fight for in the Puget Lowlands. So I'm going to read a section titled Urban Wildness, in which we try to illuminate some of those. A businesswoman in a pleated skirt and taupe pumps walks down a busy street in Seattle, negotiating a path through the crowd of people. Her double tall vanilla latte cools in her left hand, while her right palms a cell phone, holding it gently to her ear. As she passes the Washington Mutual branch on 3rd Street, she yells out her conversation, fighting to be heard over the whir of downtown traffic. Directly above, a peregrine falcon falls into a 200-mile-an-hour dive to catch a pigeon mid-flight. With her kill in tow, the falcon returns to her nestlings who are waiting hungrily atop the 54-story Tower Financial Center. Every spring since 1995, she and her mate have met on this very roof. Every spring they send off young. As one of the only 73 pairs of nesting peregrine falcons in the state in 2002, this couple is partially responsible for the regeneration of their species. As pigeon down floats to the street below, not a single person looks up. Busy shoppers, commuters, and business people are each preoccupied with what they are doing at that moment while rushing to one of the city's shops, offices, or parking lots. Not one takes notice of the fastest bird in the world, a state treasure that until last year was listed as endangered in Washington state, hunts, lives, and thrives above their heads.
My name is Tony Bush. I graduated a year ago tomorrow, and I'm also going to read out of the same chapter as Katie just read from. And this is also trying to drive the point that there is wild areas within our urban corridor that we all live in, and that they are worth defending also, and helping regenerate and restore. So this is titled Wildness Prevails. Although much of the Puget Lowlands has been degraded by industrialization and urbanization, much wildness remains. Concerned citizens have fought to preserve those yet untrammeled places and to encourage the regeneration of potential wildlands. Such efforts and continued persistence have resulted in creative strategies and widespread collaboration. As the Puget Sound metropolis expands, it is imperative that the people of the Puget Lowlands continue to fight for wildness. The task of wildland advocates is to demonstrate how much wild is left and what the possibilities for the future may be. But activists must first help Washingtonians understand that this region is not beyond repair. The lowlands are the stepping stones between the Olympic Mountains and the Cascade Range. The wildlands are what unifies the western portion of the state. Marine protected areas, conservation easements, and city parks connect urban landscapes with wild ones. The icon of the Northwest, the wild Pacific salmon, connects oceans to lowlands to mountains, symbolizing the dependence that each ecosystem has on the others. Statewide, this holistic approach would achieve the connectivity that residents, advocates, and the wildlife desire and need.
I'm Caitlin Hauser. I'm a senior, but I'm going to be a senior again next year, so I won't be graduating quite yet. I guess one of the really important things that this book does is provide a critical analysis of the movement and what it'll take to progress into the future. So, as students and authors, we spoke personally with dozens of activists and organizations in order to thoroughly understand the ins and outs of the movement to protect wildlands. We traveled all over the state, meeting with organizations that use an array of tactics and that range from tiny community-based groups to well-funded international organizations. On a sage-covered bluff overlooking the Columbia River, we ate a picnic lunch with Bob Wilson, a founder of the initially 3-person grassroots group Save the Reach. We spent an afternoon speaking to executives of the Nature Conservancy in the well-appointed meeting rooms of a Seattle skyscraper. We were privy to invaluable information from all walks of life, and we were fortunate to hear their impressions of the movement and their concerns for the future. After a few months of speaking to these groups, an interesting pattern emerged. Almost every face we saw was white. We were perplexed to find this in such a progressive and forward-looking movement. The predominantly white makeup of conservation organizations was acknowledged to be a problem by most everyone, but usually only after we asked about it specifically.
This recognition seemed to be a skeleton in the movement's collective closet, and the people we spoke to were regretful but ultimately at a loss about how to address the issue. Spokespeople for small and large conservation and preservation organizations all over the state were all bothered by this, but by their own admission, no one seemed to be doing anything very effective about it. The growth of diverse segments of Washington's population opens new doors of opportunity for the largely white movement to expand its numbers. It also suggests a chance for the movement to increase the involvement of presently underrepresented minority populations. People in all ethnic and racial groups recognize the value of wild places and agree that they should be protected. For instance, the results of the federal government's National Survey on Recreation and the Environment show that while 69% of the general population favors the designation of more federal land as wilderness in their own state, an even larger proportion of Hispanic origin respondents, 75%, supports more local wilderness. As the population of Washington changes, so can the movement to protect Washington's wild places by broadening its agenda to be more inclusive and welcoming to potential allies throughout the increasingly diverse citizenry. The survival of the citizen movement for Washington's wildlands depends on the continued existence of the dogged volunteers who willfully commit themselves to the cause regardless of pay. It is a matter of finding the next generation of prospective activists, infusing them with a love of wildness, and providing them with avenues of involvement through any means possible, whether it is accomplished by sponsoring field trips, recruiting at schools, promoting environmental education, or even pushing for more coverage of environmental campaigns on television. The targeted demographic should be those who will carry an appreciation of wildness into the future with fresh energy and perspectives, instead of being limited to those who have already made their contributions. The movement's future success also depends on young people who know and cherish wildlands. As seen in the interviews with several generations of Washington's influential and committed wildlands advocates in Chapters 7 and 9, one of the strongest patterns cutting across the activists' lives is that they all had formative childhood experiences in wild places. As the population of Washington diversifies, it is crucial that children from all backgrounds be given the opportunity to experience the outdoors. The late Ira Spring, photographer and wilderness advocate, was deeply concerned that the variety of activities and technologies available to kids is distracting them from experiencing the outdoors and becoming green bonded. Quote, "Green bonding is what a person feels as one walks through a forest of ancient trees, finds oneself in a field of wildflowers, takes a dip in a mountain lake, stands at the foot of a waterfall, stops for a dramatic view, or meets the physical challenge of a trail or climbing a mountain," Spring told the room of eager, youthful faces in a lecture to our class a few months before he passed away. We knew very well the feeling he spoke of. As young proponents of wildness, we could all describe personal green bonding experiences that had prompted us to become active.
My name is Glenn Burkhart, and I graduate tomorrow. And as Caitlin mentioned in the last reading, we did several interviews with activists, both old and young, and I just wanted to share one of the green bonding experiences that Harvey Manning had while he was a young person. As a young boy growing up in Western Washington during the late 1920s and early 1930s, Harvey experienced what he calls the edge wilderness during camping trips with his family. His first memories of wildness take him back to early fishing trips in the Cascades. I quote, "The fishing was across the White River in Huckleberry Creek," Harvey recalls. "My dad and uncles would put on their hip waders and wade the White River, which was no cinch. And we would get to the good fishing over in Huckleberry Creek, and then come back in the afternoon with creels full of trout, which my mother and my aunts would fry up. We would eat it on the spot, never take anything home. We'd eat it right there in the woods. Our folks would let us sleep outside the tent, so we'd huddle up together in our blankets out in the mysterious night and look up at the stars." End of quote. This early memory would lay the foundation for much of Harvey's future connections to the land. On a hike up the Quilcene Drainage to the high alpine meadows and sprawling vistas of Marmot Pass, Harvey found what he describes as, I quote, "the deep wilderness." "At the age of 13 in the Scouts, I went to Camp Parsons over on the Olympic Peninsula. I was introduced to wilderness. I would save up my Parsons stamps every week and would come to a Scout meeting and buy a 25-cent stamp. By the summer of '38, I had enough saved up for a week at Camp Parsons. I went on what they called the Three Rivers Hike, 3 days in what is now the Buckhorn Wilderness area. Prior to this trip, Harvey's only experience with mountain passes included highways and small stores stocked with treats. The older kids on the trip were telling the younger ones, including Harvey, to remember their money to buy ice cream at the top. But Harvey's hopes for cold treats soon faded as he fell deeply in love with the wild landscapes that were spread out before him. Again quoting Harvey, "I got to Marmot Pass, and there were no roads. We were 9 miles from the nearest road. I remember walking up there in the sunset from where we were camped at Camp Mystery, walking up a mile to the pass, and I looked out. My God, I'm in wilderness. I'm looking at wilderness," Harvey exclaimed. Until that time, I had been reading the normal adventure stories. I thought wilderness was in the darkest Africa, the roof of the world. That was my discovery that wilderness was right here where I lived. I saved up my money and went back to Camp Parsons 2 more summers.
I'll just make the last little reading here, reading from the introduction and conclusion. Those were the only things that I wrote for the book, brief introductions and conclusions. And I wanted to read a selection that would emphasize how we deliberately tried to give people inspiration and hope so that they could do the work that is absolutely necessary for citizens to protect the lands where they live. As an educator, I've always been concerned about the problem that we have in environmental studies as well as in other fields of making the world seem like such a problematic place. The problems really are so severe that we can immobilize our students by feeling that the powers of evil are so great and the degradation that's already happened and the injustices that are occurring are so great that what's the use of trying. So we definitely wanted to avoid that in our book, just as I try to avoid that in my teaching. So in the very beginning, we have some pretty alarming statistics here. If we compare the state of the wild in Washington today with what it was even 2 generations ago, it is clear that the issue of wildlands protection is best understood not just as a problem of impending loss. 21st century residents who work for the protection of Washington's wild places also have the tragic distinction of being the first generation of conservationists to live here in the aftermath of the state's extravagant frontier. Pre-20th century native peoples and non-native settlers could not possibly have imagined the magnitude of the changes that would be wrought here between their time and ours. Some of the most powerful creatures of the wild, such as grizzlies and wolves, have been nearly eradicated from our state. The churning hordes of wild salmon that annually clogged our rivers since time immemorial have been placed on the endangered species list. Only 1% of the rolling, fertile hills and native grasslands of eastern Washington has escaped plows, cows, and invasive alien grasses, making the Palouse Prairie one of our country's most endangered ecosystems. More than 2/3 of Washington's old-growth forests were cut down in the second half of the 20th century alone. A mere 30% of Puget Sound's coastal marshes is left, and intensive urban growth continues to pollute and diminish what remains. As if these statistics were not bad enough, the sizes, shapes, and locations of what is left of wild Washington paint an even bleaker picture. The aggregate acreage of the remaining grasslands, forests, and marshlands is actually chopped up and scattered across the landscape in fragments that are often of little use to the species that depend upon them for survival. That's in the introduction, and there's a lot here that actually documents it between here and the conclusion. And it's not just in the conclusion that we have hope. The students have done an excellent job of providing inspiration about what citizens have done and can do. But the final story that's told is the following. This is on the last page of the book. A few years ago, the Nisqually tribe purchased a farm by a river mouth near Washington's capital city, Olympia. Instead of farming or building on it, they proceeded to breach the former owner's dikes. Non-natives had constructed these dikes after they had assumed ownership of this place in the frontier days, when drying up wetlands was called reclamation. With this recent purchase and others to come, the Nisqually people are now in the process of reclaiming pieces of the Nisqually River in the true sense of the word. Not only is their act of reclamation a return of ownership to native peoples, but by breaching the dikes they have deliberately set free wild processes brought with the rise and fall of tidal waters, allowing wild creatures and plants to reclaim the land too. The people came to watch and celebrate as the first tide bathed the land, regenerating the environment needed by wild salmon and their entire wetland community of life. As some people danced and everyone gave thanks, one of the tribal biologists stood in the rising water, watching it rapidly advance across the slightly inclined tidal plain. Gazing down between his rubber boots, his eye was attracted to the sight of a hermit crab, scrambling along just behind the leading edge of the flowing water. This tiny wild creature was a pioneer, but it was a new sort of pioneer because it was not a foreign immigrant in this land. It was one of the very first wild creatures taking part in the reclamation of a wild wetland nearly 100 years after this place had been domesticated. With every passing year, growing populations of wild salmon will follow suit in this watershed as their estuarine habitat is regenerated. Wildness will reclaim the frontier landscape throughout Washington as soon as the imprint of humanity is lightened. Great swaths of the state, from east to west, from the mountains to the deserts and the sea, can be preserved and regenerated by simply expanding and strengthening citizen efforts already in progress throughout the state. We can reclaim for future generations the natural heritage that has been denied to our own. If we take action to pick up the wild pieces that are left, allowing them to flourish once more, it is our responsibility as citizens to do so, because only a broad and inclusive movement of informed, dedicated, and empowered citizens can make this come to pass. Thank you. We would love to have a discussion and answer questions and hear your comments, so please feel free.
Well, I have read almost all of the book now, and I definitely am intending to use it in my protected areas class next spring. And I think you've made a tremendous contribution to the field, and the concreteness and the tangibility of your stories, I think will do a lot for bringing more people into the activism fold. And so I really appreciate what you've done for all of us.
I've got a general question for all of you. Maybe some of you could pick up on this. I'm curious how you chose your particular topics. This question came to me when Oliver was speaking about the east side, kind of not explored as much as the west side. And I got a sense that he understands the east side by some of the comments you made. Are you from there, or did you go there because you didn't know about it and you wanted to learn more, and you spent a lot of time there? So all of you, if you could give us just a very quick rundown.
Well, I'm not from there. I've lived in Washington for about 7 years, and it's been on the west side. But I had a strong interest in what was going on over there, certainly. But as far as how I decided, or how we all decided, which parts of the book, I don't know. Too long ago to remember. Because it was the most interesting to me, personally.
If I could follow up then, your comments about the social environment being different there, and environmentalists having to deal with different issues, is that something you yourself experienced, or that you read before you went there and kind of assumed what other people had experienced and written about?
Well, from being over there, researching for the book, and speaking to conservationists there, listening to their stories and the experiences they've had, and there's a small town called Republic in northeastern Washington, and there was a large town meeting, and it was there were a lot of logging trucks there, and George Nethercutt was there, and you really got the feeling of where the majority of citizens stood on conservation. And Republic's also a town where the Kettle Range Conservation Group has its headquarters. And it's a very small town of less than 1,000 people, and they have their office right on Main Street. And Tim Coleman, who is the head of the Kettle Range Group, has been accused of many of the community's woes. So, just experiences like that, if that answers your question.
Yeah.
I could provide a sort of overview of the one chapter, chapter 6, that was authored by one individual alone. But students were presented in the beginning of the program with a proposal for an outline for the book. I had cooked it up fairly quickly and felt like it was something that needed to have a serious discussion and critique. And then once the outline was reviewed and discussed and settled upon, once we had chapter outlines, etc., that then became possible. It became possible for students to say which chapters they wanted to contribute to. And so they would just write down on a piece of paper and hand in to me and Oscar their suggestions, and we would look them over, and sometimes it was pretty obvious that certain people would be writing certain chapters. Sometimes there was a little bit of a conflict and there had to be some negotiations. So that was the structure. That doesn't answer your question about the reasoning that each student had for selecting what they wanted to, but that was the structure they were presented with, and then they had to think about what they were most interested in learning about. And for some people, I think it was what you were saying, that it was a subject they felt comfortable with, and for others, they were looking for a challenge. They wanted to learn new things and didn't really necessarily have much background.
And I'd add that from a kind of curricular design standpoint, it's not uncommon for students to bring their agenda into the program and then look for avenues to, or vehicles to express that. And in this particular case, the students didn't do that. They joined in what was of interest to them, but it was in the context of the project. And Ted and I made it clear that this wasn't to be an advocacy exercise, that they needed to listen to both sides of the argument, using Republic as an example, that the people who feel one way have a reason for feeling that, and people who feel the other way likewise. And it was the responsibility of the students to listen to both and then reach their conclusion. It didn't need to give equal balance to everything all the time, but both sides had to be heard, which calls for a special kind of student. It doesn't call for a student who has a biased perspective and doesn't have time to hear the other side of the issue. And so that's why it's, to me, a very special group of students.
I was really privileged to work with some of you throughout the process of this, and really excited. And one of the curiosities I've had, I'm so glad to see you all in a group here, is if some of you could talk a little bit about maybe some of your most surprising / interesting or frustrating research challenges. There's a lot of research in this, and it spans all kinds of different resources for that, and so I'm curious about that.
I can speak a little bit to that. I worked with Katie and with Lynn Scabdahl on oral history chapters, and it was a big challenge, but a great joy to meet all the different people. The most challenging, I guess, was to sit through a 2.5-hour interview with a person and give them your full undivided attention. It was quite difficult as the time wore on, you know. And then scheduling with people, that's really difficult. And then just having the knowledge to go into the interview and be prepared to know what is going to happen. So to prepare ourselves, we went to the University of Washington Archives and dug through boxes and boxes of old correspondence, you know, from the late 60s and 70s, to get a sense of the history of what was going on. And we did this in also with Chapter 6, which is the Conservation History chapter, with Sean Olson. And so that research was used, you know, throughout those chapters. So that was a challenge. It was new to me to be introduced to archive research. It was new to do oral history research, things that I've never done before. And so, and that's also to answer the your question a little bit about why I chose those chapters is because it was something new to me. And I was really inspired by Ann Kilgannon, who gave our lecture on oral history research, and just inspired me to go towards that direction.
I can add to that, and just so much of the information that is in the book is not like published in other places. So we had a very extensive like library research, but a lot of it is primary research. So we had to be in contact with people, and doing the oral histories, we had to travel all over the state to go meet people, wherever they may be it Republic or Seattle. So it was a lot of travel time and just time intensive all around, and a lot of primary research, which was pretty new to all of us. I think is a whole nother. We've been doing research papers and that style library research, and that was one of also the things that just got us really involved in what we were doing, is that we were talking to the people, and we all became passionate about whatever our subjects were because we spent an entire year working on them. So I guess that answers kind of two questions.
I can say a lot of this stuff is pretty, we wanted this book to be pretty cutting edge, and like for my chapter, or one of the chapters I worked on, called Surfing the Tides of Change, Understanding the Shifts of Washington's Social Landscape, it was difficult because so much change has happened in the state in the last 10 or 15 years that it's hard to find what was the most updated information, and also especially like the section on racial and ethnic diversification, something that, well, like I said, that the conservation movement really hadn't approached, and there wasn't a whole, like, really any information available about it, but TED was a really helpful resource, I guess, for that. So he gave me a lot of direction as to where to find that kind of information. But yeah, I think a lot of people had that problem with the cutting edge information. So it's probably already out of date in a lot of places.
It's also worth noting that for those who follow up on the research, that the interviews were either audio taped or videotaped, and those materials are going to be in the Evergreen Archives and available to for future study.
Yeah, this book, actually, we wanted it to be about 3 times as big as it is. Not really, but we certainly had enough material, and it was very hard to decide what not to put in. And so that's a really good point that Oscar raises. There are some things that the students collected that I think will be of interest to other conservationists, to scholars, to historians, that we just couldn't put in the book, or we put in the book in a very abridged form. And so that'll be available in the archives.
One of the reasons for the oral history section was the aging part of the movement. And in the case of one person, Ira Spring, he's already gone. And others are going to, unfortunately, be gone way too soon. And this might be the last record of their being interviewed.
Just to follow up on Liza's question, Liza was one of the people who helped us learn how to do some of the research that the students did, and it was very gratifying for me to see how excited and happy the students were when they started doing it. You know, it wasn't a chore for a lot of people. I mean, it was a lot of work, but discovering the joys of reading an archive, which is something that may have never occurred to Glenn in his entire life. I mean, he's an outdoor kind of guy. He likes to go out in the woods. Sitting in an archive just probably never dawned on him as being something that's fun. But the first part of every week, I can't remember if it was on Monday or Tuesday, we set aside a big block of time for the whole group of 17 students to share with each other what they've been doing over the weekend or in the past week. So, you know, some people would say, well, I just came back from Eastern Washington and I went to this amazing meeting in Republic where, you know, all these loggers were very upset because the mill was closing down. And, you know, Glenn would come back and say, well, I just went to the archives and it was a real blast. And it was so fun for me to see, you know, these research techniques really being so gratifying and exciting.
I felt so bad for the librarian who was helping me, the archivist who was helping me, because order up 3 or 4 boxes, but it would take me like 3 hours to get through one box, and by that time, it was time to, drive back to Olympia. And so she'd have to put the other 3 or so boxes back on the cart and put them back in the archive. I just felt so bad because I wanted to have all this information. This was, and it was so
We
intriguing.
love that. We are so happy to hard boxes.
So,
Other questions?
I really like that term green bonding, because that's something that always concerns me with younger people coming up. Is there opportunity for that? And I wondered if any of you would like to tell us a little bit about your own green bonding experiences.
I'd like to. I went with a group, the Wilderness Volunteer Corps, into the woods to do trail maintenance for 2 weeks, and then did a 1 week of backpacking in the Glacier Peak area. And when I was 15, just turned 15, and before that, I guess I knew that environmentalism was important and I cared, but that was my green bonding experience where I was like, oh yes, these places really, really do need to be saved. So, yeah. So I'm really into the environmental education groups.
Yeah, I participated in the Washington Conservation Corps, which is an AmeriCorps program before I came to college here. And it provided me money to go to college, but it also allowed me to live and work in Mount Rainier National Park and really start to experience these issues firsthand. But I think that through the research we've done with this book, I became inspired to do that as well. And so I've spent the last 6 months working at an environmental education center with children outside of the New York City area, and just seeing kids say, is that a forest? Are we in the forest? Or just asking them if they've ever played in a pond and having them say, no, I've never seen a frog. It is important.
I know you've been taking the book around to different groups. I wonder what sorts of audiences you've been seeing and what their responses have been for.
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about that since I'm working as an intern with the Mountaineers books and doing the promotional work. We started off debuting at the 2004 Wilderness Conference, which was in celebration of 40th anniversary of the 1964 Wilderness Act. And so in that audience we had conservationists, preservationists from all over the country, and many from Washington State, and many of the people who we actually interviewed. And so it was very very satisfying to have that audience there be our very first audience. And there's actually pictures on the table there you can check out when we're done here. So they were very warm and received, we were well received. And it was just very, very nice to have that. Other than that, we've gone to sustainability conferences. We've done other readings like this. We've done programs with the ERC. And we've done presentations to the Northwest History Conference, which was a presentation of the oral history work. Let's see, next Saturday we're going to be at Barnes & Noble doing a meet and greet. Other than that, all the groups, we met with Terry Tempest Williams, which was really great. We got to share our work with her, and just everyone has been so wonderful and welcoming. It's great. Those are the kind of groups that we've been speaking to.
Yes.
2 questions. Is there a website for the book? And my second question is, how has going through the process of putting this book together changed maybe what you thought you wanted to do in life, or make your life passion as far as environmental activism goes?
There's no website.
You can find it on Amazon. That's there's the website. And if you do indicate that you like the book, it helps us.
We already have a 5-star review on it.
I said I know.
None of us wrote that. But that's a great question, so I'd like to hear the answers.
speak to that a little bit. I worked on the Puget Lowlands chapter, as I mentioned, and also a chapter on the visions, future visions of the movement. And one of the things that I studied a lot was regeneration and restoration efforts that are going across the state. And directly following the end of our course, I went into an internship with the Department of Transportation doing wetland mitigation work right around here, and that actually turned into a job after that. And so I can actually have my hands in that work and see it from kind of almost within the beast, you could say, and really try to, hopefully make a difference. And so just by the studies that I partaked in and what I wrote for this book, it really inspired me to continue with that line of work. So.
I think that I got more inspired to do more advocacy kind of work, more community-oriented work. Prior to this project, I was more into the scientific aspect of environmentalism, and now I'm more inspired to take that and apply it in more of a community sense and to be part of the advocacy process.
For me personally, I worked on the chapter of the Olympic Peninsula and Coast Range. And initially, when I started into this class, I kind of wanted to get back into school and study environmental issues, and I really was kind of visioning a totally comfortable state job position that had good benefits and got to get me out of the office every once in a while to do some studies. And I found myself working with an organization known as the Olympic Force Coalition, and with a very dynamic leader named Bonnie Phillips, if any of you know who she is, and her history in this state. And suddenly I found myself as a board member and much of my free time focusing on trying to address the issues on the Olympics currently, and the aspect of becoming a full-time activist is now more realistic probably than I had ever expected before. And because of this book, I had that avenue and I have that experience. So it's given me a lot as far as something in my life, a life experience.
Well, I wanted to thank you.
Can I say one last thing? This book is about how to affect change, and we actually want to thank, as Ted did, he thanked the friends for their support in the college. Eddie he wasn't an inspiration, but he gave us inspiration when we went up and visited with him about what it takes to write a book. He put it in real terms, and Sandra was here a few minutes ago. We talked to her about writing and the like, and we used case studies to show people how change is affected, and the money that the friends gave us and the money that we got from the academic side of the institution at the end allowed us to put the colored plates in the book. We found out that, as probably many of you know, that publishing can be a vanity exercise, and if you have enough of your own money, you can write a book. Well, we didn't have enough of money to do it, but we worked out a deal with the Mountaineers that through a series of grants and this, that, and the other thing, that we would finance the book. They would do some, we would do some. And when we got all done, we were short. And if it hadn't been for those two gifts, there wouldn't be the colored plates in the book, and the book wouldn't be nearly as effective as it is. So if you like evidence that by supporting things, it can actually change them for the better, here is a classic example. And so really thank you all very much.
I'd like to thank you as a citizen and inhabitant of Matt for your work. It's obviously was a daunting task literally the life of the planet. And I'd just like to thank you for that and congratulate you on this book.
At the level of collaboration that you all must have experienced to do this work and bring the book into existence, it's really wonderful to think about. That is inspiring, I have to say. Are there other questions, comments? We need help eating this food. I wanted to congratulate Oscar.
For eating the food?
No, I think you're about to become faculty emeritus, is that right?
That's what they say.
That's what they say. We'll see if you get it. Congratulations.
And Oscar, now I see what you should be talking about at graduation.
Absolutely.
I mean, this is the experience you should be talking about as graduation.
Well, you might have read some of my notes.
Well, I'd also like to say that while you're munching, if you'd like to get yourself a copy of the book and bring it over to be signed by some of the authors, you're welcome
How
to do
often
that.
do you get to have 10 authors available to sign?
Thank you for coming.